Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hi everyone. Today we are breaking down Heated Rivalry, episode 1, an episode that functions less like a pilot, I would argue, more like a thesis, and discussing how it so effectively establishes tone, character dynamics, emotional rules of the story, often without calling attention to itself. And we're going to look at how Shane and Ilya are introduced, how competition becomes a form of communication, and how all of the early choices in the performance and structure are inevitably what shapes the relationship to come. So this is a close read, not a recap. Let's break down every scene in Heated Rivalry, episode 1. The opening scene of Heated Rivalry is taken almost verbatim right out of the books, but there are some key differences between how the show sets up the dynamic between Ilya and Shane and how the book does. The first chapter opens in Ilya's point of view, even though we're in third person, and it's talking about how for years now, much has been made of Shane Hollander, but Ilya has not met him yet, and he's ready to really destroy him in this tournament. In his head, this is going to be the year of Ilya Rozanov, and in the book there's a line that says since he was 12 years old, 2009 had always been the year he expected to burst out into the world stage, and no Canadian pretender would change that. Interesting, because he'd been thinking about it since he was 12, which is the year his mother died, and as we see in episode 2, Ilya channels a lot of his hurt and frustration to win the Stanley Cup after everything that happens with the Olympics, so it's kind of a mirror to that here. In the book, Ilya actually participates in the practices before he meets Shane. The show has them meet in the very opening scene so that they know each other and what each other looks like before the practice scenes. So in the book, when Ilya notices a man sitting a few rows above the penalty box wearing a Team Canada shirt and hat, he doesn't know for sure that it's Hollander, but thinks it might be. It isn't until after the practice that Ilya goes outside and smokes outside in this scene here. And in the book, Ilya is smoking when Shane walks up to him and says, "You're supposed to smoke over there," and points to like a smoking section next to a pile of snow. And Ilya does not want to go over there. Ilya supposedly recognizes Shane right away and notes that he has a very distinct look. Some of his features clearly from his mother, but his skin he notes as being flawless, distractingly so, smooth and tan with a smattering of dark freckles across his nose and cheekbones, which Ilya describes as his most striking feature. Just like in the show, their first conversation is very short, with Ilya only responding with a few choice words, and he is hyper aware of how stupid he thinks he sounds with his accent. In the book, Shane also brings up his parents and asks Ilya if his parents are here to watch, so they cut that out. There's a quote in the book where it says Ilya looks down at Hollander, who's a good 4 inches shorter than him, and notes he's very interesting to look at. When Shane gets ready and goes to leave, in the book, Ilya notes that his eyes went straight to his freckles again. This sort of competitive nature between them about not being so friendly when we beat you and that's not happening also takes place in the book, and Ilya knew that Shane truly believed they would win. And Ilya kind of calls him the Prince of Hockey. In the book, after this whole conversation with Ilya, he gets back in the car with his parents, and when his parents ask what was he like, Shane says he was kind of a jerk. Since the show rearranged the scene and the practice is after the first conversation, I want to note that it calls out specifically in the book that the jerseys don't have names on them. In the show, they decided to put them all in the same jersey with their names on it, which is not typical of a hockey practice. That's also meant to make it harder for Ilya in that scene to pick out Shane from the group, whereas obviously in the show it's very obvious who Shane is. In the book, when Ilya notices someone sitting up in the stands, he notes that he knows Hollander is half Japanese or something. He had read that somewhere. And the coach, asks care to join us, Rozanov, because he's getting distracted. Ilya in the book feels embarrassed because the rest of his teammates were huddled around the coach and he realizes that he was spacing out in that moment. But Ilya internally says that he doesn't like the idea that Hollander, if that was Hollander, was watching them. And then he goes back on that and says, or maybe he did. Maybe Hollander was nervous about facing him later in the tournament. Maybe he felt threatened. He should. What I like about the show change is that because they've already met, it kind of makes it very clear to us early on that the two of them noticed each other in a different way, so much so that it's become distracting to them. When Russia beats Canada in the tournament, Shane is furious and notes that Ilya is really good. Shane feels really upset by this. He was supposed to have led his country to gold. He had high hopes of being the first round draft pick, and he is second. And he noted that every face-off he took against Ilya, he saw that he was smirking, and that smirk threw him off balance during the game. Chapter ends with, maybe it was just that. After a life of playing at a level above everyone else, Shane had finally met his match. He was sure that was all it was. The draft scene and the scene of Shane and Ilya in the hotel gym play out slightly different than they do in the books. And there's a few key differences that I wanted to highlight. In the show, it's been 6 months since Shane has seen Ilya, and he notes that he has grown a couple of inches and he looks much older. We can see that he went number 1 and Shane went number 2, and he's really upset about that. In the books, it says Shane has spent the past 6 months since the World Juniors being a little bit obsessed with Ilya Rozanov. He thinks internally about how similar they are, how they both are captains of their teams, led their teams to championships. They'd been named their league and playoff MVPs, scoring leaders in their leagues. But the difference now is that Shane went home with silver and Ilya went home with gold. For him to then come in second place again after a life of always coming first in hockey, it makes him really resent Ilya. Yes, he had been drafted by Montreal and that was all great, but he knew that he was going to be playing against Ilya a lot because Ilya had been drafted by Boston. So their careers are now going to be inescapably linked. This is the first time in the book, too, that Shane kind of acknowledges that their rivalry is starting. During the draft, Ilya kind of pats Shane on the back and says congratulations. And Shane recalls feeling like he was consoling a child who had struck out at Little League. So Shane has already built up a very strong feeling about Ilya, and it's one of Ilya is superior to him. In the book, he's constantly comparing himself to Ilya. So Ilya is taller than him now. Shane felt short. They had both turned 18 within the last month of this scene, but Shane recalls feeling like he is still a kid, whereas Ilya looks like a man. There's a funny line where Shane says Rozanov had turned 18 too, just last week, which Shane knew because he was obsessed with him. So it's important to know all of that going into the scene because Ilya could say anything. And at this point, Shane will think that he's poking fun at him or belittling him because Shane has basically constructed this archetype of Ilya as being better, being the winner, and Shane hasn't interacted with anyone like that yet, and so he is having a very hard time reconciling it. When Shane's in the hotel room and he can't sleep, I love this scene because Hudson Williams has made Shane such a believable human. When he gets up out of the bed, he makes it again, like he fluffs the pillow and like straightens the bed, and I just think that's such a really genius detail to make him feel fully realized. So Shane decides maybe I can shut my mind off by going down to the gym because he was sulking. He was bothered. And poor Shane, he doesn't realize it's because he's attracted to Ilya yet. He's just thinking that it's because he's angry that Ilya beat him. But there's something deeper because he has a thought about trying to ignore Ilya's presence when he enters the gym. He thinks, maybe Ilya had trouble sleeping too. Maybe he always went to the gym after midnight. Maybe it was a time zone messing with him. And then he lets himself believe, or maybe it could be something else. He could also be thinking of Shane in the way that Shane finds himself thinking about Ilya. When the two of them start to kind of turn up the speed on their machines, in the book, they're running on a treadmill. In the show, they're on the stationary bikes. What I think is important to note here is that, yes, we're watching a romance play out, and so a lot of the characters' motivations seem to be driven by the other person, meaning that, he's competitive with Ilya because he loves Ilya. But these two men are professional athletes, and they got to where they are now because of their competitive nature. So I think it's important to separate them. Shane is competitive regardless of whether or not Ilya is involved in the situation. Ilya just plays up their competitiveness in their relationship down the road. It's a facet of their relationship that he uses to get a rise out of Shane, to make things fun, to make things playful. But the fact that they always are raising the bar to one another is another reason why I think they are attracted to each other. They're pushing each other to be the best because they understand what that looks and feels like. In this scene, when Ilya seems to be effortlessly beating Shane again with his endurance, Shane has a thought about how he's, annoyed because Ilya smokes, for God's sakes. Shane should be able to beat him. To me, that's another key difference between these two characters, is that Shane works really hard. He's very disciplined. He does everything right to kind of make sure he is the best. And Ilya is one of those people that kind of skates through life on the surface. It looks like everything is effortless to him. It looks like everything comes easy to him. And at this point, Shane doesn't understand all of the things that are driving Ilya as a character to be the best. And a lot of it is actually from a very dark place. And Shane has this really kind, supportive, loving family. Ilya doesn't have that. And that's what's been motivating him to become what he is now. Whereas Shane has had people encouraging him to become what he is now. It wasn't done out of desperation so much as Ilya's was. When the two of them finally kind of stop their little competition, they kind of collect themselves and laugh on the floor. And I love how this shot is kind of blocked and the use of the mirrors here, because mirrors are very symbolic in film and TV. And I like that in the show they place them facing each other. In the book it says that Ilya joined Shane on the floor, wedging himself into the corner and sitting perpendicular to Shane. So this change to have them facing one another is also a visual cue that they will use later on in episodes further down the road, thinking about them on the couch facing each other in the finale, for example. In the book, Ilya runs a hand through his hair, and Shane notes that it's more interesting than it should have been because Rozanov was so masculine and Shane was baby-faced, short, couldn't grow proper facial hair, couldn't have grown any chest hair. And Ilya was the same age as him, but looked like he had crossed over a magical line into adulthood. As Shane's thinking this, he glances at the floor to try and hide his blushing, and that's when Ilya says, "What a day, huh? Everything you've dreamed of?" Shane says, almost, and Ilya in the book says, "Sorry, I ruined your big day." I really like that in the show it's sorry in his accent. Ilya then asking, "Montreal is nice and Boston is nice." I love this because Ilya's alone. He doesn't know anything about the States. His father's not going to be with him when he moves here. And Shane's really the only person he's met that he can ask these questions to. And he's kind of identifying Shane as a person that he could theoretically be close with or friends with, especially since they're going to play each other so often. But Shane, like I said, has already decided that everything that Ilya says to him has to be a hidden insult. And so he probably thinks of it as, great, we're going to see each other a lot. You're going to have more opportunities to beat me again. When Ilya takes a drink out of his bottle, Shane in the book says he pretended he was only looking longingly at the way his throat worked because he had forgotten to bring a bottle for himself. And this is when, Ilya kind of quirks his lips at him and extends the bottle to Shane. And at first he denies it and says, "I'm all right, thanks." And Ilya insists that he take it, and Shane knows it would be dumb to refuse. When their fingers brush each other in the books, it's the first time Shane says that he felt it. It was like the air in the room had thickened. Everything inside him was buzzing and on edge, like he was about to jump out of a plane. He didn't know if Rozanov felt anything, but in that moment, Shane wanted something. He couldn't even name it. When he passes the bottle back, Shane says this time he swears Ilya let his fingers brush his on purpose, and it was a moment that seemed to last forever, but it was probably less than a second, and Shane wanted him to touch him again. He wanted to touch him back, and then it says Shane maybe wanted to kiss him. In the books, when he has that realization, he scrambles to his feet and says, I'm going to bed. I guess I'll see you around. And Ilya looks up at him and says, "You'll be seeing plenty of me." And Shane ran away as fast as he could and waited until he got back to his hotel room to kind of let himself freak out, which we see Shane do in later episodes. In the book, he's thinking to himself, what happened? I have a girlfriend. And he realizes that he was going to break up with this girlfriend. She didn't even go with him on this trip. He has given himself all this plausible deniability, but realizes that something just happened internally with him, with Ilya. The chapter ends with Shane realizing that for the rest of his life, he would have to live with the fact that he ended his NHL draft day thinking about Ilya. This scene in the first episode is the first real scene we get to see Ilya's family dynamic in full display, and it plays out slightly different in the show than it does in the books. In this chapter, it's mainly Ilya's POV, and we get more insight into how he feels about Shane and his family and everything going on at this point in the story, which is December of 2009. He had just left his team to be alone in his hotel room when the clock strikes midnight. He points out that Ottawa is Shane Hollander mania, and the city is as inoffensive and bland as Shane was. And their teams hadn't played each other yet, and they likely wouldn't until the gold medal game. And he really thought that it was going to end up being Canada-Russia in the finals. He thinks to himself in this moment, pretty soon I'll be moving to Boston, to America. He'd never been out of Russia for more than a couple of weeks at a time, and he would begin his NHL career. He would be rich and famous. He would be his own man, away from his family. And that's when, he gets a call from Alexei, and we get to see his family. In the book, he really wants a cigarette, he wants to go hook up with someone, and then he admits he wants to go down to the hotel gym and find Shane Hollander on a treadmill. But Shane wasn't staying at this hotel, and he thinks to himself that he nearly embarrassed himself in the hotel gym in Los Angeles 6 months ago now. He'd been really close to flirting with Hollander, possibly kissing him. And he registers that he doesn't think Shane would have hated it if he did that. He thinks that he might have kissed him back, and it's consumed his every thought since draft day. He had hooked up with women since then, and he identifies the fact that he doesn't have a reason to be obsessing over his rival or his rival's freckles or his dark eyes or the way his cheeks glowed. And it's the first time when he feels like, okay, he's taking over my thoughts. In the book, we then flip to Shane's POV, and he is, spending New Year's with his family and thinking about Ilya as well. So in the show, they instead choose to focus in on Ilya's relationship dynamic with his brother and his father through these phone calls. But we learn in the book that in the aftermath of that hotel gym scene, Shane has been noticing men, and that he thinks of that interaction he had quite often. I do like that in the show they chose to insert this scene where Ilya is talking with Alexei about his father, and you can tell that Ilya is younger than his brother because he calls him baby brother. He also is asking him for money again, and we can see Ilya say that he's already used all of his bonus money. We also get the implication that his brother spends all of that money on drugs and that he's irresponsible with it, but Ilya feels obligated to send him money anyway. After he hangs up with Alexei, his father calls, and this is when we start to understand that his father really is quite mean to him. We saw that in the opening scene in LA after the draft, and I love that this is shot so that there's a slow crawl from the doorway of the hotel room and closing in on Ilya's face during his phone call with his dad. It's like his world is shrinking when he's on the phone with his dad. His father also says, "We will not lose to him," meaning Shane, so even his father is feeding into the rivalry between Shane and Ilya. That very short interaction tells us everything about Ilya's very high expectations that he has resting on his shoulders, which is in direct contrast to Shane's home life with his parents. In the book, Shane and Ilya actually have a little kind of conversation at the face-off dot before the game ensues, and it says that Shane made sure that they won that game. And in Ilya's POV, he says that, Ilya took hockey very seriously and he hated to lose, and he wasn't proud that he was going home with a silver medal. He didn't actually want to return to Russia at all. He wanted to stay in North America and actually start the next phase of his life because he didn't want to listen to his father, who hadn't even probably watched any of the games, shame him for not bringing home the gold medal. He didn't want to live with his father, depend on anyone anymore. He wanted the weight of his family and his country lifted. He wanted to be himself. Ilya recalls that when they were going through the handshake line, it had only been a second, but Shane looked into his eyes and it felt like the world around him had fallen silent. And Ilya recalls that when he squeezed his hand and Ilya's fingers just a little, that look and that squeeze had said so many things to Ilya. My favorite passage of that whole interaction is Ilya thinking to himself, "We were supposed to stand alone at the top, but we will always be there together. We will keep climbing until no one can reach us, but it will always be together." And when he goes through the line, Ilya is smirking to himself because he realizes that the real battle between himself and Shane would begin soon, and he was really excited for that. And that's what flows into chapter 4, which is when they are shooting this commercial together. Both Shane and Ilya had been signed to CCM, which is a hockey brand, And Shane hadn't seen Ilya since the World Juniors back in January. This is supposed to take place around July in the book. When Ilya calls him pretty and says, yes, but you look pretty, Shane in the book says that he's been called pretty boy a few times before, usually during games, and he normally hated it, and he wished that he hated it this time. Because Rozanov did not look pretty, Shane says that he looked stunning. Much of this interaction plays out similarly to how it's written in the books in terms of them laughing at each other. At one point, they're told, try not to laugh, I know it'll be challenging, and Shane thinks that that's not what he's worried about. He needed to relax his eyes so Rozanov's features blurred to try and keep himself from staring at his mouth. I think this is such a cute way of showing that they're human. You know, they're allowed to have fun and have a light moment between them when all up until this point they've been in these situations where they need to be serious and angry. I also think this is one of the few moments in the story where you can kind of tell that Ilya is capable of being very funny. And I think all throughout the show, he's very funny, but Shane, again, goes into every interaction with him thus far thinking that he's poking fun at Shane or trying to one-up Shane or belittle him in some way because Shane is insecure. And Ilya represents all the things that Shane is not. Throughout this entire scene, he thinks to himself about how manly Rozanov looks, how much older he seems than him, and it's very much holding up a mirror to Shane's own insecurities, and that filters in through his thoughts. So he thinks, Ilya's motivations might not always be that sincere towards him. The way the show chooses to kind of insinuate that Ilya isn't that superficial is through this additional scene they added here where we learn that Ilya is the one that orchestrated this entire shoot together. I think this was a really simple but effective addition to the script to make it clear that Ilya is also interested in Shane, because up until this point, we really haven't seen any of the interest in Ilya, and this is a kind of more point-blank way of saying he's just as invested. When I'm comparing the books to the TV show, there's a few scenes that are added into the TV show that don't show up in the books. This one with Shane and his mom is one of them. And it's a great scene because it shows us how Yuna behaves as a mother. She's constantly trying to manage Shane. But this is also an opportunity where they bring up that Shane's ethnicity is going to make him a different type of star. If you look at Shane's hip in that scene, you can see that he is wearing his hockey pants, so he has the bottom half of his equipment on. It's not like he is dressed and then going to go take a shower. But she brings up that he has sponsorships now with Reebok. He has a Reebok shirt on. This is important later on. She wants him to wear his sneakers because it's a big brand deal, and she wants him to take it seriously because he is now kind of a public figure for Asian Canadians, specifically in hockey. But Shane's distracted that entire conversation by Ilya, who's still out on the ice shooting his portion of the commercial solo. In the book, Shane hurried into the showers to see if he could be out of there before Ilya came in, but he doesn't have much luck, and Shane had just gotten his hair wet when Rozanov entered the showers and stood under one almost directly across from him. So in the show, they have them side by side. And Shane acknowledges that part of being a hockey player is taking showers in rooms like this one, and that's part of the game, but he admits that he's never looked at any of his teammates before because that was just unthinkable. But he finds himself looking at Ilya, and he describes it as being transfixed because he's clearly visibly turned on by Ilya in the shower, and it's like a horror show for him, and he drops his first F off, which Shane says is an insult multiple times throughout the series. There's actually dialogue in the book. Ilya says, like what you see, Hollander, and Shane says, no, it's not. I was thinking about something else. And Ilya questions him, something else? I like the decision here to keep it totally silent, and there's a lot of exposition, but the gist of this scene, Shane feels spellbound and surprised that Rozanov could be considering him seriously and possibly enjoying the effect he knew that he was having on Shane. Shane has a thought, just another goddamn thing for you to hold over me. Keep in mind that in the last chapter, Ilya admits that he thought Shane was interested in him in the hotel gym. And so he's really kind of acting on that curiosity, trying to see where the line is with Shane here. And Shane notes that Ilya's eyes were full of an intensity that was much more heated than they were when they were doing their photo shoot on the ice together. There's more dialogue that's very obvious what Ilya is thinking. He's asking Shane, what are you thinking about? And Shane actually says, you. In the show, Shane just runs out of there and into the locker room. You'll note that his mom told him to wear his Reeboks, and he is putting on New Balance sneakers here. I love this shot because much of this show in the first 2 episodes, there's a lot of orange and blue colors, and the lockers in here are kind of like that orangey red color on one side and blue on the other. And Shane's overwhelm is very obvious by his, pause sitting on the bench before Ilya comes around the corner and then fumbling his sneakers onto the floor. Ilya, meanwhile, I think is probably pretty happy to know that Shane is interested in him in a way that he was unsure about. He got confirmation. And so Ilya kind of makes the first move here. So when Shane says, look, we can just pretend that didn't happen, okay? And Ilya asks, is that what you want? In the book, Shane says, yeah, of course. And Ilya says, you are a bad liar. When Ilya asks for his room number, Shane acknowledges that he gives it to him far too quickly. And then when Ilya says, if I knock on the door tonight, maybe around 9, Shane fights to keep his voice even and says, I might open the door. And Ilya smiles and says, I might knock. I love this shot where he kind of just nods his head and squints his eyes like, oh, what am I doing? And the next line in the book is, Shane spent the evening freaking the F out in his hotel room. And so this whole scene is so perfect. I love that he puts on this suit and says, what are you doing, dude? And in the book, he says, he considers all his option. He could leave. He could go out for a few hours, and then when Ilya shows up, he wouldn't be there. He could just ignore his knock. Or he could take the coward's way out and tell him that this was all a ridiculous misunderstanding and they would go their separate ways. The physical acting here is really smart. I love how Hudson Williams handled this situation in the books. It says Shane tidied up the room even though it was already neat, changed his shirt to a nicer one for no reason at all, brushed his teeth, flossed, rinsed with mouthwash, fixed his hair, switched his phone to silent mode, turned on the television so it wouldn't look like he was just sitting there staring at the door. He put on a baseball game. He shut off all the overhead lights, turned on all the lamps, checked himself in the mirror again. And in the book, Ilya is late. He shows up at 9:07. And I love that we got the insert of Ilya's experience of him going up in the elevator and seeing Yuna on one of the floors. I think this is such a great payoff for the end, especially in the finale, because you wonder if Yuna recalls this moment and kind of connects the dots. And Ilya knows who she is. He is very much aware that this is Shane's mom, and I love after the door closes and it kind of eliminates the possibility of them having any sort of a conversation, you can see just how flustered Ilya is by this, and he does his eye tracking that he tends to do a lot when he's overwhelmed or overthinking. It's the first crack in this facade that he might be nervous too, because up until this point, it mainly looks like he's calm, cool, and collected, and Shane's very nervous, but we know that Ilya is also nervous. From here, much of the scene plays out like it does in the book, but Shane thinks that Ilya put effort into his appearance as well, and he notes that his hair had been kind of tamed except for a lock that had fallen across his forehead. So I like that in the show they kind of do that here too with his hairstyle. Book version, Ilya does say, I thought you might have chickened out, but Shane says, no, I just want to talk about, He's much more pointed in the book about wanting to redirect where this is going. In the show, he kind of gives in quickly, and you can see that he's the one that reaches for Ilya first. For the most part, what goes down in this moment is very accurate to the book, with Shane being rather stiff and overwhelmed by the fact that this is actually happening. He really feels like he's imagining it. This is an interesting scene to compare to the book version of events because obviously a lot of what's happening is inside Shane's head in the scene. But the biggest thing that you can tell in the books is that Shane's panicked. That's his main and primary feeling in this moment. In this moment, he says it feels like he's made of alarm bells, like his panic was going to somehow wake up the entire hotel. And it's primarily because it's Ilya. It's because it's Ilya. This first scene between them is kind of meant to demonstrate that because Shane's never done this before, he is battling with himself internally the entire time because he knows that he shouldn't want this, and yet he does. So Ilya very much guides him through this entire ordeal. Everything is new to him, and everything is kind of sending him spiraling because he's never allowed himself to think that this is what he could want, which is only heightened by the fact that Shane doesn't believe that Ilya, in particular, could want it with him. And in large part, he's very much surprised by how naturally everything comes to him, how intuitive he feels about how everything progresses. And Shane gets to a point where he knows there's no going back from this. They'd crossed a line anyways, and he might as well take what he wanted. The other important thing to keep in mind is that Shane wants to be good at everything. He's a very competitive person. And so throughout this entire experience with him, he's also thinking about that. He knows that Ilya has been with men before, and Shane is hyper aware that Ilya knows he hasn't. In the book, he also admits that he's thought about doing this when he's been alone, and he was embarrassed about it afterwards. When Ilya says to him, "Stop, stop, stop," Shane thinks that Ilya must feel overwhelmed. It was too intense. It was wrong. He didn't want to guess what Ilya was feeling, but as soon as Ilya kind of tells him, no, I am also enjoying this, it frees Shane up a little bit. When Ilya says that Shane makes him curious, Shane reflects that Ilya makes him feel confused, infuriated, terrified, and also curious. He also feels very young and boyish compared to Ilya, which again is something that he kind of is dealing with and grappling with through much of these early phases of their relationship, and he has a hard time believing that someone like Ilya could be attracted to someone like him, and that's again a lack of self-esteem. Their interaction in this scene also is another example of Shane's insecurity that Ilya is just determined to one-up him at everything. When they're laughing, it's because they both acknowledge that the absurdity of the situation is kind of hovering over them. And I love when Shane says smoking's bad for you. It's just another Shane-ism that Ilya does find endearing, similar to how he smiles at Shane when he's folding his clothes. In the book, Shane actually has the urge to ask Ilya to stay, and he imagines falling asleep together. But the follow-up thought is that he couldn't have chosen a less appropriate person, and that he needs to stop pretending that this could ever be anything more. He tries in his head to convince him that he wants Ilya to leave his room. He wants to forget it ever happened. He doesn't want to reach for him or pull him back into the bed and do everything they just did 2 or 3 more times. When Ilya gets up, he looks back at him and gives him one of the crooked smiles that in the books Shane always says makes him go kind of loopy in his head. And when Ilya says, "My flight is early tomorrow," Shane thinks there might be a note of apology in it, which I feel is represented very well in the show version as well. In the book, Ilya says, "I'll see you around," and Shane says, awkwardly, "I'll see you on the ice, I guess." And one of the last things that Shane thinks in this chapter of the book is that he wanted to kiss Ilya again because he was positive he would never get the chance to again, but Ilya was already opening the door. I love all of Hudson's choices here with his facial expressions because you can see that he has multiple emotions washing over him at that point. But at the same time, he is happy, and he has the most subtle little smile to show us that he's happy. Knowing that that's what's actually going on in Shane's head when rewatching this scene, I think it makes Hudson Williams's acting choices here when he's sitting alone in the bed make a lot more sense. Especially when you consider that he has basically had the unthinkable just happen to him. He never considered that this would be a possibility, especially with Ilya Rozanov. And at the end of it, he's kind of excited by it, but also completely terrified. After that encounter, it is months, 2 months, before Shane has any sort of interaction with Ilya again. In the show, they note that it's 3 months later and they're in Montreal. In the book, he's watching this interview on television. In the show, they make sure to show us that Shane has an old phone and he's watching this 4K video on it. And in the books, it says that when Ilya's face fills the screen, Shane feels his own face flush a bit, which was ridiculous because he was alone and not actually in the presence of Ilya. But he has these overwhelming feelings just seeing him on screen. Shane also has this feeling of kind of shock that Ilya has the audacity to state out loud that he plans on scoring 50 goals this season. Even though Shane himself plans on scoring that many goals too, he just would never think of saying it because he didn't want to be seen as cocky. I think this is such an important thing because if you didn't play hockey, which I did, the hockey culture is very much team first. And if you are making any sort of me or I statements, you're often kind of shunned for it. For Ilya to come onto the scene and be so outwardly confident is kind of abnormal in the hockey world. And so he would be getting a lot of TV time just for being that way, because it is out of the norm for normal hockey players. And Shane very much wants to fit into that mold of a hockey player, and so he does everything to kind of ride that line, whereas Ilya kind of goes outside of it. This scene where Shane's having lunch with his parents plays out a little differently in the show than it does in the books, but the sentiment of the scene is still the same. This is the first scene where we see Shane eating a meal with his parents, and the blocking is significant because he is centered and the two of them are flanking him, which is going to come up again as we continue to see him eating meals with his parents, and in the final episode when we see him eating a meal with Ilya beside him. But right now he's the center of their world and they are very much a big part of his. He talks about being late because he went down a YouTube rabbit hole about unlikely animal friends, which again is kind of a metaphor for him and Ilya, given that the two of them are rivals and they should not be even friendly with each other, let alone what they just did in the hotel 3 months ago. In the book, Shane feels very nervous about his game tonight against Ilya, and he's kind of vibrating with that nervousness throughout the duration of his lunch with his parents. And I think Hudson does an incredible job conveying that with his body language here. He's very uptight. This scene also is a visual way of representing what Shane thinks about in this scene in the book, which is that he's got a very big support system via his parents. He knows that most guys in the league don't have their parents coming to almost every home game, and
Unlike
he's
Ilya,
proud
he knows
of the
that he
fact
wouldn't be
that
in
his
this
parents
position
are so
without
supportive
them.
of him and grateful that they live so close. He also mentions in the book that he's never really felt the need to distance himself from him because he was an only child, yes, and he knows that they supported him and put a lot of energy and money into him, but he also liked them. And that's in direct contrast with what we know about Ilya's family life, which is important to remember. When Una shifts the conversation to Ilya himself, you can see Hudson's acting choice here to kind of hold in a breath and stiffen as soon as that comes up. His face conveys so much, and even as Una is saying, what audacity he has to think he's better than you, Shane is thinking to himself, well, he is better at some things than me, and is letting the memories of their time in the hotel room kind of come back to the forefront of his mind. And I really, really love how he tries to shut those emotions down, but you can see these little smiles break through every once in a while because he's remembering so much about their time together. In the book, his parents also recognize that he's nervous and they ask him why. And he says it's just because he wants to win. And Eunice says, you will. Screw Ilya Rozanov, right? That can be your mantra tonight. And Shane thinks to himself, or not, but then says, sure, screw him. I like the change in dialogue in the show, though. It's quite funny. In the book, Shane points out that the hype around this game was very intense. Theoretically, this would be one of the first times in their rivalry that they're playing against each other. Now, if you're not a hockey player, you wouldn't know this, but this scene was kind of funny to me because the game is at Montreal, which would mean that their team has the last change. And in the show, they have Ilya go on the ice second as a sort of dramatic face-off between the two stars. That wouldn't happen. If they're playing in Montreal, then Shane's going to be on the ice after Ilya. And again, them hyping up a face-off, that usually doesn't happen either. Ilya's line, will you disappoint them? I love the delivery of it, and I love his mouth movements. Connor Story has done a fantastic job building Ilya's very Eastern European face, given that he's American. And in the book, the POV switches to Ilya's during that face-off, and he notes that he probably would have won the face-off if he wasn't so focused on bothering Shane. He ends up being very mad at himself, not his team, himself, because they lost the first game against Shane. And this moment in the show doesn't take place in the books where they show Shane on TV. So it's kind of like a mirror to the beginning of this scene when Shane's watching Ilya on his phone. Now Ilya's watching Shane on his TV in the hotel room. Shane's interview is also indicative of what I was talking about before. It's the opposite of Ilya's. He's very much team first. He doesn't want to put the emphasis on him, and he falls into the stereotypical hockey player role that Ilya does not. And this moment here, I knew Ilya had it bad because he's basically pouting about losing and jealous of Shane. And they're both jealous of each other, which is ironic. This scene between Ilya and his brother Alexei is a really great narrative device in the show Heated Rivalry because it shows us pretty candidly what his dynamic with him is right away. We can tell that this is not the first time that Alexei is asking Ilya for money. I think it's important to note that Ilya says he's basically done with his signing bonus. And for those who don't know, hockey players' salaries are significantly lower than those of the NFL or the NBA. Back in 2009, the signing bonus was only about $90,000 a year. And in the book, Ilya says his brother either was making a bad investment, already had made a bad investment, or he was gambling, or something else that a police officer really shouldn't be doing. In the book, we also get the context that Ilya knows he could say no, but he also realizes that if he does say no, then his father would call him next and give him a speech about family and how to be a good son. And even though Ilya hated his brother, he was still his brother. Ilya also brings up his father in this conversation, and at this point he can tell that something's wrong with his dad, but Alexei is choosing to ignore it. They actually flip-flopped the scene because in the book, Ilya has the phone conversation first and then he hangs up and sees Shane on the TV. He has some strong feelings about hearing Shane speak French because Ilya feels like a cartoon villain speaking English and he hates his accent and he hates his family. Ilya tells himself that he was jealous of Shane, but in actuality, he's terrified that it was something much, much worse, which is he's developing real feelings for him. But I do think the sentiment of that scene in the books is translated quite well in the show. When we see them in Nashville for the All-Star game, Shane's actually leading Ilya in the goal scoring competition. He has 41 and Ilya has 38. Before this conference, Ilya was wondering what Shane was doing as he was laying in his hotel room, and then wondering why Shane Hollander was so hard for him to shake off, given that they'd hooked up one time months ago and it had obviously been a mistake. Ilya came to realize that he actually really likes playing against Shane, even though he'd never tell him that, because Shane's really good and he challenges Ilya in a way that he's not used to. We know that Shane feels the same way about Ilya as well. And in the book, there's a whole 2 paragraphs worth of Ilya talking about how he's watched Shane from afar and how he loves watching him get frustrated, how he loves watching him interview, and how boyish and adorable his smile is, which is ridiculous because he doesn't even have Shane's phone number. I pointed out in my last scene breakdown video that Ilya and Shane embody 2 very different approaches to what it means to be a hockey player. If you're not familiar with hockey culture, it's very team first. So for Ilya to be giving interviews and be as like cocky and me and I as he is very abnormal. And Shane in this interview falls back into that stereotype that most hockey players fall into. He always tries to make comments about how the team comes first and it's a team sport and he's just trying to contribute in any way he can. In the book, Shane is thinking to himself that Ilya looks really great during this press conference and it's distracting. And the book has a few more questions from reporters, but I like that they kept the interview concise in the show. When Ilya gets asked a pretty big question, he gets flustered by it, and Shane observes that he has a few mannerisms to indicate his discomfort. Notably in the book, Shane notices Ilya rubbing the knuckle of his forefinger with his thumb. And this is something that actually happens quite a bit in the show, as does this foot tap under the table, which they pay off in later episodes throughout the series. In the book, Shane acknowledges it was the chastest contact in the world, but it made his heart stop. Ultimately, the fact that he is having this kind of secret moment with Ilya while all these cameras are on him, while everybody's there observing them so closely, it's very charged. I also think this is a great scene because if you watch Ilya throughout Shane's answer, he looks like a little kid. It's one of the few times that we see him not presenting as very confident, and his body language mirrors that quite obviously. He looks lost. He looks very disconnected, which is unlike what we've seen him like in majority of the interviews so far in the show. Whereas Shane fits into this narrative of the stereotypical hockey player easily, and Ilya is jealous of that. It's one of the first examples of how disconnected they are in their communication because both of them are jealous of the other person. They want to be able to behave like the other person behaves. Ilya wishes he was as eloquent as Shane. Shane wishes he was as outwardly confident as Ilya. They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin going through this together. At the skills competition, I had to laugh at these pictures. Everything about this is pretty on the nose. Most NHL players, when they go to the All-Star game, they don't take it seriously. It's just kind of an opportunity for them to hang out with guys they don't usually hang out with and have a good time. And in the show and the book, it's pretty clear that the league is trying to play up the rivalry between Shane and Ilya, which means that they make them go head-to-head a lot in the competitions and events. This is also another opportunity to remind us that these two men are competitive. Regardless of how they feel about each other, they are competitors. A detail I loved is that Shane's visor is tilted up. That's something that a lot of rookies tend to do with their visors in hockey when they get into the league. It's kind of a subtle detail that I thought was realistic, even though as a hockey player myself, I can tell that Hudson doesn't know how to shoot a puck. When Shane gets back to the bench, in the books, he notes that Ilya wasn't smiling, but looking at him in a way that was very different than normal, and Shane felt flushed, so he turned his attention to his teammates. He was trying to focus on players competing for hardest shot instead of Ilya, who was just a couple feet away from him and he was hyper aware of. We get another example of how Ilya is quite funny and sarcastic, and he knows how to get a rise out of Shane. When Ilya says going to bed a little early tonight, I think Shane's mouth in the book goes dry. In the show, they're sitting on their respective benches, but in the book, they actually have Shane skate over to the point where the two benches meet so that he's purposefully closer to Ilya. They're also standing in this scene, and in the book, Ilya is taller than Shane. I like that in the show, they're the same height, though. It kind of puts them on more equal footing, literally and figuratively. The other change here is that when Ilya gets Shane to laugh, you can tell how much it affects him. It's one of the few glimpses we get into Ilya's headspace of how he thinks Shane is funny. Because Ilya thinks that Shane's dorkiness is adorable, and it's true throughout the series. When Ilya gives Shane his room number, 1221, the book actually has the character of Liam Casey sitting next to Shane when that happens. The show uses this as an opportunity to introduce Scott Hunter, which I think is really clever given that episode 3 is all about Scott and Kip's storyline. The line about Scott Hunter's room being next door to Ilya's was also added in for the show. In the book, Liam Casey, who is a defenseman for Pittsburgh's team, just asks, what did Rosenoff want? And Shane says nothing, just shit-talking, you know? And he says, guy's an asshole, and Shane agrees, and then the scene ends. So this is really great foreshadowing for what happens in episode 3, but also how important Scott Hunter is for Shane and Ilya's story. In the book version of this scene, Ilya isn't surprised when Shane knocks on his door, but it's after midnight and he'd been sitting alone in his room for about 2 hours before Shane decides to show up. When Shane enters his hotel room, he bursts through the door, and the line in the book is actually, is there a ghost out there? But I prefer the show version where he asks if someone was chasing him. But in the book, Shane says, this is dangerous and you know it. And Shane is sarcastic with him and says, is it? We're not doing anything. And Shane looks at him with anger and lust like he does in the scene. And Ilya says, you came anyway. And then just like in the show, he launches himself at Ilya. Hudson Williams said in an interview recently that he made the decision to kick off Shane's shoes before he lunges towards Ilya because it would be the very Canadian thing to do. But he does a great job displaying Shane's desperation here, which is made very clear in the books. And then Ilya tries to test the situation by giving Shane orders for the first time just to see what he would do, and is floored when Shane actually obeys him. This is a dynamic that shows up time and time again in their relationship because of the element of control. Shane's life is very controlled. He controls most of what happens in his personal life. And so when he's with Ilya, he relinquishes it to Ilya. Ilya's life, he has no control over. Everything going on with his family back home is completely out of his control. And then when you find out later on about the loss of his mother, he's been feeling out of control ever since she died, and probably long before that. So in this dynamic with Shane, he's able to gain some of that control back. Interestingly, though, in the book, there's a quote where Ilya is saying that he's careful not to hold Shane too firmly in place because this wasn't control. Ilya just wanted to touch him. And for much of this scene in the books, Ilya is really kind of floored by the fact that he's the only other person to ever see Shane like this. Ilya also is really encouraged by bad ideas and sleeping with someone when it's dangerous. And Shane was the worst idea imaginable. He spends much of his time in his head trying to convince himself that he hates Shane. And then he sees his freckles again and he kisses him so that he doesn't have to think about him. That sort of desperation and loss of control feeling that he has, I think they did a good job portraying that in the beginning stages of this hookup scene. And then they also showcase that Ilya is actually very attentive and caring, which will come up later on as their relationship progresses. He's also respectful of the fact that Shane doesn't want the first time that they sleep together to be in this hotel room surrounded by media and fans and fellow NHL players. But Ilya is determined to make a plan. So he says, we'll play you in 2 weeks. We get the really funny, "Are you homeless?" line, which is direct from the books. There's also a lot more talk of logistics in the book, like Shane asking, "Do you just want me to wait for you at home?" And in the books, Shane actually tries to cancel on Ilya for their 2-week later hookup. And Ilya's pretty determined, so he demands that he gives him his phone, puts his number in, and names himself Lily. In the book, Shane actually suggests that his name should be Shannon, which I think is hilarious. In the books, Shane spends a lot of the next chapter kind of thinking about the situation a little bit more seriously, and he's shocked that Ilya actually wants to come to his house and hook up with him. And he thinks about, maybe I just need to find another guy to fool around with because it shouldn't be Ilya Rozanov. But he knew that would be risky because he's in Montreal and he's Shane Hollander, and if word got out about the situation, it would not end well. By this point, Shane gives himself 3 choices. Forget about men, stick to women, risk finding other men and be discreet, or let whatever's happening with Ilya keep happening and try not to overthink it. To him, the first option is the least appealing, even though it makes the most sense. And he really kind of acknowledges that it's crazy that he's even thinking about a long-term secret relationship with Ilya Rozanov. In the show, they create this obstacle of a snow-in, which is kind of unlikely in the NHL, but it adds to the tension and also introduces the text messaging dynamic between them. Whenever you're adapting a book to screen, there's going to be a lot of filler scenes that help to take internal dialogue from the book and visually explain the context to the viewer. This sequence of scenes are all show-only scenes that help give us as viewers more context into the other key players of this series. So before the end of the first episode, they needed to introduce key people like Hayden Pike, which is Shane's best friend on the Metros, and showcase their dynamic between one another, which is that Hayden really wants to be Shane's friend and invite him into his world. And for Shane, that's a big deal because Shane keeps to himself almost entirely. Because there is this missed opportunity for Ilya and Shane to get together, Ilya goes back to his apartment in Boston. In the books, it's definitely a penthouse apartment. In the show, they give him a home that's way outside the city in the suburbs. And when he gets back to his big empty house, you think he's going to spend the night alone, and we are introduced instead to the character of Svetlana. She is a character that they changed a lot from the books, and this scene, we don't get too much context into her role in Ilya's life, only that she's Russian, he wasn't expecting her to be there, and they have an established rapport. She's close enough to tell him off. She's also very close with him to have the key code to his house, and she wanted to surprise him when she learned that their game was canceled. This is also a great way for us to learn that Ilya is bisexual, because up until this point we've only seen him interacting with Shane. When Shane texts Ilya as Jane, we can see that Svetlana doesn't get jealous. She thinks it's kind of funny. And again, that's establishing the dynamic between her and Ilya, but also that Ilya has women in his life. While Shane sits with Hayden's family at their dinner table and is thinking of Ilya, but doesn't get a response out of him here. So this one missed opportunity puts them back 4 months before they see one another again at the MLH Awards. And we see that Shane is up for Rookie of the Year alongside Ilya and a player from Minnesota. In the books, Shane and Ilya actually sleep together for the first time before the MLH Awards. The show has moved that to episode 2. By this point, the season's concluded, and Shane and Ilya had both scored 67 goals. They both had led their teams to the playoffs for the first time in 2 years, and then they both were eliminated in the first round. Shane notices in the books that competing against Ilya has brought something out of him, because he wasn't the type of guy who typically needed to be the best player on his teams, because he just was. And Shane had been a little bit bored before Ilya came along, because Ilya made him actually have to work for it. This scene also reminds us again of Scott Hunter. We bring him up once again before the end of the episode so that you kind of understand that he is that senior elder statesman player in the league, very respected, very well liked, very well spoken, and makes an effort to get to know Shane. But it's clear throughout this scene that Shane is searching for Ilya all night. In the book, Scott Hunter is not the one who asks Shane if he's seen Rosanov. When it all gets too much, Shane goes to leave to get some air, and he thinks to himself, I wonder what room Ilya's in. He must be at the casino or the bar, or he could be in his room or someone else's room. But he ultimately ends up finding him on the roof for the final scene of the episode at almost 2 a.m. In the final scene of episode 1, there's a few changes from the books that I wanted to highlight, because this is a really important scene as we continue to set up what the dynamic is going to be between Shane and Ilya moving forward in the story. I've already established that Shane very much has built an archetype for Ilya already, and at the core of it, he feels inferior to him. Pretty much anything that Ilya says, Shane assumes it's meant to be an insult or to belittle him, because Ilya is better than him and he always wins. Shane just won the Rookie of the Year award, and he thinks that Ilya has been hiding on this roof all night because he can't believe that Shane could beat him in something. But that's an incorrect assumption on Shane's part, and we later learn that he was up there for a multitude of reasons. When Ilya says such an exciting night for you, this is another example of Shane internalizing his own beliefs that Ilya thinks he's better than him, that he can't stand that Shane could beat him in something. Much of the struggles that these two have at the beginning of their relationship to communicate with each other comes from their own insecurities, specifically Shane, because he has this inferiority complex when it comes to Ilya. And yes, Ilya is sarcastic and he can be cruel with his words, but it's never really been about that for him. He says things to get a rise out of Shane because he thinks it's endearing. Is that healthy? No, but that's how he's communicated thus far with Shane. One change in the show is that when Ilya says not everything is about you, Hollander, in the books, he didn't look at Shane when he said it, and his voice hadn't been angry. He just sounded tired and sad. And as soon as Shane registered that, his anger left him and he found himself caring about Ilya, which he found odd. The line about, what do you want? Nothing. I came up for some air to see the view. Here is view. That's all taken from the books. But the show version of Ilya is clearly agitated. Shane in the book is looking at Ilya and notices his jaw clenching and the hardness of his eyes, something that I think Connor did a really phenomenal job here in the scene, because we really only get to see his profile for the rest of this conversation. And he makes this bid for connection by saying, I go back to Russia in 3 days. And Shane only says, oh. And in the books, he notes that they're silent for a beat because he wasn't sure if Rosanov had more to tell him or not, and he didn't want to push things because it's not like they were friends. In the show, he says, must be nice, and that is kind of triggering to Ilya because it's not, and his home is not a place he's excited to go back to, unlike Shane, who has a great family life. They're unaligned in this. Shane assumes everybody's family life is like his, and Ilya's couldn't be more opposite. It's just another roadblock that we'll see come between them as their relationship progresses, but right now they don't even know it's there. In the book, Ilya and Shane kind of reach this uncomfortable impasse, so Shane kind of removes himself from the situation and goes to leave. In the show, Shane says, and I guess we were kind of implying that he thought they were more than friends. I liked this change because I think by this point, that is very safe for Shane to assume. But it also highlights that he really does think that Ilya is actively putting up a wall between them. And that perceived distance is really evident in this scene. But the ultimate irony is that they both want to be closer to one another and don't know how to articulate it yet. This scene is primarily in Shane's point of view in the books, so we don't necessarily know for sure what Ilya is thinking here. But there are other moments in the books where Ilya kind of wants to take advantage of his proximity to Shane before he has to go back home to Russia, and I think the same thing is happening here. He wants to kiss Shane so that he has something to remember for the duration of his summer when he goes back home. So when Shane offers his hand to him and says, "I guess I'll see you next season," and Ilya approaches him and pushes him back against the wall, Shane's surprised, and in the books he feels panicked because he knows this is dangerous and stupid and confusing, but he finds himself kissing him back. And he's angry because screw Ilya for doing this, hiding all night on the rooftop, smoking a cigarette, and he says in the books like the worst cliche of a brooding heartthrob, and making Shane feel bad for winning an award that he deserved, which is not what Ilya is doing. It's self-inflicted. And Shane's having all these thoughts reeling in his head until he realizes, what are we doing? And he shoves Ilya back. And even though he knows nobody would have seen him and there was nobody up there, there could have been. And that scares Shane. In the book, when Ilya smiles at him, Shane's stomach flips and he says, "We can't." And he meant that, but it hurts him to say it. In the book, Shane also says, "I have to go. You should go to bed, Rozanov." And Ilya's smile disappears. And unlike the show, in the book, Rosanov's the one who turns and walks away towards the elevators after he says, "See you next season." In the show version, Ilya is left on the rooftop, and we can see that he's looking out over Las Vegas, contemplating something that's weighing very heavily on his mind. So Shane walks away knowing that next season would be different because he has to end this thing between him and Ilya. The look on Ilya's face here is very conflicted because I think he's feeling the same thing, but realizes just how deep his feelings are starting to get. He would risk being seen on that roof to continue kissing Shane, and he knows that. And just having that very short moment with him on the roof, even though it's been 4 months since they were last together, is kind of like fuel for Ilya to get through what he knows will be a really crummy summer, which bleeds really perfectly into the montage that we see at the beginning of episode 2.